We have many capable scholars in our social science department, and tonight it is my honor to present another one of our very able historians who will talk to you about the revolution, the Russian Revolution. Dr. Bast received his bachelor's degree, and there is such a college, at Slippery Rock, his master's and his PhD from the University of Pittsburgh. He wrote his doctoral dissertation on the Soviet leaders of planning, 1928 to 1933. Last summer, he spent in Russia, and next summer he is organizing a tour. Some of you may be interested in going along with him to go back to Russia again. Tonight he is going to talk to you about the Russian Revolution. It is my pleasure to present to you Dr. Benjamin Bast. Ben?
It's just like 8 o'clock in the morning again, and we have classes in this room, though rarely does the instructor get plotted when he begins. It's difficult to think of humorous situations concerning the Russian Revolution. There are only a few jokes, and perhaps that is significant. One of them is about a program similar to the Today Show in Russia, and the show takes place in Leningrad, and the question, or the people who are leading the show, go out into the city to talk to the citizens of the city, and they find an old man sitting on a park bench, and they say to him, "Where were you born?" And he replied, "St. Petersburg." "Where did you graduate from high school?" And he said, "Petrograd." And they asked him, "Where do you live now?" And he replied, "Leningrad." And finally, they asked him, "Where would you like to be?" And he replied, "Petrograd." You have to have some idea of what Crane Brinton calls the changing of names that goes along with revolutions to understand the significance of this reply. This story, by the way, comes from the Russian humor magazine Crocodile, so that it does have some significance. The only other revolutionary joke that I can think of to begin such a lecture, there are a few that can't be told, concerns a disgruntled citizen of Moscow who's riding in the public conveyance of the 1920s, and he's very unhappy, and he talks about what the difference is. Actually, it's a little bit later than that, 1950s in Moscow, and he talks about what the difference is between the two dogs who are up in the rocket and life in Moscow. And an individual says, "Well, what is the difference?" And he says, "The two dogs in the rocket are dead." Another man sitting in front of them turns around and he says, "Do you know what the difference between this bus and you is?" And the individual replied, "No." He said, "This bus goes on, you come with me." But it is difficult to think of something humorous about as awesome a spectacle as a revolution. And perhaps we do the revolution wrong to attempt to approach it in any form of levity. In fact, even to approach the revolution is difficult, depending on where you are attempting to make your approach. In America, there is always the danger that if you talk about the Russian Revolution in anything but condemnatory tones, you in turn will be suspect. And in Russia, if you talk about the revolution in anything but praiseworthy tones, you will be suspect. So to introduce the topic, I'd like to quote from a great Russian novelist, a man who lived through the revolution, Alexei Tolstoy, describing the autumn of 1917. It was all over in the deserted streets of a quieted Petersburg. The icy wind blew bits of paper about, scraps of army decrees, theater posters, appeals to the conscience and patriotism of the Russian people. The shreds of paper of all colors, with the paste dried on them, rustling ominously, slivered along with the snakes of blown snow. That was all that was left after the recent noisy, mad goings-on in the capital. The idle crowds had left the squares and streets. The Winter Palace, a hole in its roof made by the cruiser Aurora, was empty. Members of the provisional government, influential bankers, and famous generals had vanished, nobody knew where. The dirty streets had been stripped of their elegant carriages. Well-dressed women, officers, civil servants, and public figures, all who had walked there with their thoughts in turmoil. More and more often at night, hammering could be heard as stores were boarded up. In some places, things could still be seen in store windows. Here, a little piece of cheese. There, a small, stale pie. But this only increased the longing for the life that had vanished. A frightened pedestrian hugging the wall cast sidelong glances at the passing patrols, groups of resolute men with their red star on their caps and with their rifles muzzle down over their shoulders. The north wind breathed frost into the desk windows of the houses and blew into deserted porches, blowing away the ghost of past luxury. Petersburg was awesome at the end of 1917. Awesome, inscrutable, ungraspable. All had come to an end. All had been abolished. A man in a battered hat, carrying a little brush and pail, was darting back and forth across the street, swept by blown snow. He pasted up leaflets bearing more and more new decrees, and they stood out white patches against the centuries-old doorpost of the houses. Ranks, decorations, pensions, officers' insignia, the old spelling, God, private property, and the very right to live as one pleased, all had been abolished. Abolished, abolished. The bill sticker gazed truculently from under his hat in at the plate glass windows of the houses. Inside, the inhabitants were still wandering through the cold rooms in their felt boots and fur coats, wringing their hands and repeating over and over, "What's going on? What will happen now? The end of Russia. The end of everything. Death." These paragraphs from Alexei Tolstoy's Revolutionary Scenes emphasize the psychological depression which was a result of the most revolutionary months in Russian history. The revolutionary period from March 8, 1917 to November 7, 1917 had constituted 8 months of military anarchy in the midst of a national war effort. Counter-revolutions in the midst of revolution. Several provisional governments in the midst of workers' soviets which wielded real power, and elections for a national assembly in the midst of a general peasant seizure of land and property. From March to November, the Russian people experienced a more profound upheaval in government and social order than few people in history. It is not any wonder that finally men should turn from a desperately weak, democratic provisional government, striving to maintain a supreme military effort, to a conspiratorial seizure of power by a group of professional revolutionaries proposing a program of peace, land, and bread. The course which led to the final seizure of power by the Bolshevik minority is a complex and tortuous road, plagued with possible alternatives and surrounded by chaotic and swift-moving forces, which made a mockery of careful planning and courageous action. In light of our present understanding of the world in the 20th century, it appears axiomatic that almost all modern revolutionary movements have ended in a totalitarian dominance of the left or the right. To the optimistic observers of the February-March Revolution, only the freedom from the Tsarist police state was anticipated. Overnight political imprisonment, press censorship, restriction on political meetings and parties disappeared. Only the nagging problem of maintaining the superhuman struggle on the Eastern Front remained. All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. No theater in history has been as crowded with the variety and multitude of characters who were to fill the Russian stage in the year 1970. A review of the leading actors and their position in the drama of the Russian Revolution will serve to provide the necessary dramatis personae, which always precedes every Shakespearean tragedy. Carry the metaphor of the tragic play even further. The Russian revolutions can be divided into 5 acts. Act 1, the preceding period of the reign of Nicholas II, reaching a climax in the military and economic failures of 1916. Act 2, the months of January and February, in which Duma leaders and staff officers discussed the coup d'etat, while the masses of Russian workers and peasants became more desperate. Act 3, the March bread riots and the breakdown of the Tsar's government, both physical and mental. With the simultaneous formation of the Provisional Committee of the Duma leaders and the Revolutionary Soviet of Workers and Soldiers' Deputies, culminating in the evolution of the Provisional Government, with Prince Lvov as its head, Kerensky as the heart, and the Soviets as the arms and legs. The 4th act is the eventual leadership of Alexander Kerensky and the series of attacks from left to right, which rapidly sapped the strength of the center democratic forces in Russia. The 5th and final act opens with the attempt of the conservative military elements under Kornilov to destroy the Kerensky government, and ends with the successful seizure of power by the Bolshevik revolutionaries led by Leon Trotsky and V.I. Lenin. As one of the great revolutions of the 20th century, the Russian Revolution has not been without its biographers. Indeed, in the present age of ideological conflict, opposing factions have been more concerned with the ideologically correct interpretation of the revolution than they have with the search for the elusive historical truth. Tsarist, cadet, social revolutionary, Menshevik, Bolshevik, Stalinist or Trotskyite, fascist, democratic capitalist, if there be such a creature, all have had a hand in the creation of the image of the Russian Revolution. The Russian Revolution has had far too many Burkes, Carlyles, and Weems, and has been too recent in the life of man to produce a Mommsen or a Lord Acton. Documents abound in plenty. The Archives of the Russian Revolution, 22 volumes, and the Red Archives, 106 volumes, are available in Russian. Numerous memoirs, reflections, news accounts, autobiographies have created a flood of conflicting impressions, judgments, and rationalizations of the events of the Revolution and the whys of the Revolution. Talented novelists have had a field day in writing truly historical accounts in fictional stream of consciousness vehicles, while talented historians have done the same in writing truly fictional accounts in carefully documented historical vehicles. Not only because of its size and its age, most Marxists contend the revolution has not stopped, but because it is bound up in an age in which all civilized portions of the world are an immediate part of the historical process of any section of the world. The Russian Revolution defies analysis on simple national terms. We may be forced to wait a later age, not as deeply involved in immediate events, before we can come to grasp the historical truth of the Russian Revolution. But still we try. Bibliography has become part of the historian's stock in trade. It is supposedly an index of the value of his statements. The longer the bibliography, the better the history. The more erudite the sources, the more correct the judgments. The modern historian, such as Arthur Schlesinger, Jr., who tacked on the longest bibliography to a controversial and incomplete study of Andrew Jackson, is in danger of someday facing the same type of revolution that the poor professors of the University of Bologna faced when their students rebelled and enforced the rule in 1317 that no one might spend the whole year on introduction and bibliography. My bibliography will be short and incomplete, but I hope useful. First, some of the more important participants of the revolution, and a word of warning here, no participant can ever be trusted. Alexander Kerensky, in the work The Catastrophe. Leon Trotsky, The History of the Russian Revolution. Paul N. Milyukov, History of the Second Russian Revolution. These are all in English. I won't give you any more Russian sources. Victor N. Chernov, The Great Russian Revolution. Some collections of documents are those of John Bunyan and H.H. Fisher, The Bolshevik Revolution, 1917-1918, and Alexander Kerensky and Robert Paul Browder, The Russian Provisional Government, 1917. Works of the professional historian include Edward Hallett Carr's A History of Soviet Russia, The Bolshevik Revolution, Michael T. Florinsky, The End of the Russian Empire, and William Henry Chamberlain, The Russian Revolution, 1917-1921. Several novelists should also be mentioned because they possess certain qualities which transcend the art of the historian. Alexei Tolstoy, Revolutionary Scenes and the Road to Calvary. Boris Pasternak, Dr. Zhivago. Michael Soloviev, When the Gods Are Silent. Michael Sholokhov, And Quiet Flows the Dawn. And the short stories of Babel and Gorky. Tsarist reaction is best exemplified in the novel From Double Eagle to Red Star by Krasnov. The novelist, freed from the scientific approach of the historian and inspired to expose the soul of man, can often be a source of insight for those who seek rationalization for human events outside the sphere of logical analysis. The historical novelist deals with the individual against the backdrop of historical forces. The historian is more concerned with institutions and historical forces within a framework of individual actions. How significant a role can any individual exercise on the outcome of the clash of historical forces? This question is most important in analyzing the events of the years immediately preceding the Russian Revolution. As a religious and political autocracy, Russia could be more easily swayed by the aspirations and the ability of one man than most other great states in the 20th century. If Russia suffered a revolution, the cause can be more easily traced to the actions or inactivity of the one individual who possessed legally, and in the minds of the bulk of the Russian people, divinely, more power than any modern ruler. This man was Nicholas II, Tsar of all the Russias. How much he was the victim of circumstances, and how much the events preceding the revolution can be ascribed to his actions is debatable. But he, more than any other man, had the power to influence events. Like Louis XVI before him, Nicholas II inherited a state already marked for change and possible upheaval. In 1894, when Nicholas came to the throne of Russia with his young empress, Alexandra, Russia was a country experiencing industrialization and foreign involvement in imperialistic ventures that could only lead to embarrassing defeat for a people not yet able to cope with modern industrial powers. Also, increasing unrest among a peasantry led to expect more from the emancipation of 30 years before and receiving less. An intelligentsia that had been at war with Russia's government throughout most of the 19th century, a government strangled in a welter of bureaucratic and even medieval customs which encouraged inefficiency and corruption, and wedded to the principle of class before ability in the matter of promotions. Under the stern reign of Nicholas's father, Alexander III, the Russian autocracy had developed the rigid position of opposing any compromise with the increasing demand for parliamentary power on the part of the Russia's developing middle class, and thus drove a wedge between itself and the one group that could have made some step in the direction of reform from above rather than revolution from below. Nicholas II, like most men, should not be blamed for his inheritance, nor can we expect a man tutored by the most reactionary Russian religious and political leader, Constantine Popiadonostas, to understand the new forces that were to sweep Russia and her czars into disaster. Nicholas II has been described by his contemporaries as well-meaning, congenial, and weak-willed. His wife, Alexandra, as domineering and stupid. Crane Brinton makes a point of drawing an analogy between Nicholas II and Louis XVI, in which both men suffered from domineering and ignorant wives. I don't know whether this makes Crane Brinton a misogynist or not. Both monarchs were abysmally educated for the task before them. Their one desire seemed to be the preservation of the powers of the Russian autocracy in the face of increasing demands for constitutional reforms. Under Nicholas, the oppression of the intellectuals and reformists continued to drive the Russian intelligentsia and middle class away from the government. Despite the efforts of a few able ministers, such as Witte and Stolyepin, inefficiency and corruption in every phase of the Russian government continued under a system that worshipped reaction. Even the great upheavals of 1905, which forced the Tsar to decree a constitutional government, only served as a momentary check upon the reactionary policies of Nicholas and his ministers. What could have been the gradual evolution of parliamentary government in Russia was distorted by Nicholas into a weak and ineffectual body, the Duma, which only reflected the sentiments of a highly restricted portion of the Russian people. By 1914, Nicholas had surrendered much of his authority to his wife, Alexandra, who in turn was influenced by a collection of quacks, sycophants, and religious fakers, exemplified by the activity of the most infamous of all, Rasputin. Many students requested that I talk about the career of Rasputin. They're more interested in the negative aspects of man's activity in history than his positive ones. We'll have to leave this question, however, for a later day. The amazing fact is not that revolution broke out in 1917, but that it took so long in finally reaching the surface. Some type of revolution would have come to Russia even without World War I. But those years of terrible suffering due to mismanagement and backwardness of the Russian government did finally convince almost all classes of the Russian people that the autocracy must go. Compared to the senseless slaughter of World War I, the Russian revolutions appear extremely mild in terms of human loss. Three of the major forces driving Russia to revolution have been cited: an incompetent and stubborn autocrat clinging desperately to absolute power, a reactionary and corrupt bureaucracy unable to adjust to the new age of industrialism, in which government could only succeed when it took into its power structure the new middle class with its energy and abilities, and finally, the participation of Russia in the greatest war in the history of mankind, which placed such a strain on the fabric of Western civilization that not one nation was to emerge from the war without vast changes in the attitudes of its peoples and its institutions. defeat in World War I meant revolution in Turkey, Germany, and Austria-Hungary. It is not any wonder that defeat for the far weaker and incompetent Russian government would bring revolution. Act I draws to a close in 1916. The Russian armies on the Eastern Front suffered defeat in the spring of the year in the northeastern sector. A tremendous effort was launched in the summer of 1916, known as the Brusilov Offensive, to capture Galicia and to destroy the Austro-Hungarian army. The meeting at first was successful, but finally the offensive resulted in the bloody repulse of the Russian armies, who were unprepared to sustain the military offensive. There are some examples given, some of the works of military historians. One battle on a major front was opened with artillery preparation, which was standard by 1916. The Russian artillery preparation consisted of one salvo. That's all they had ammunition for. For the first time, large numbers of deserters began to swell the ranks of millions of refugees who had been driven out of the battle zone into Russia proper. In September of 1916, Nicholas II assumed personal command of the armies, and some reforms were undertaken in the Ministry of War to ensure better munitions and general supplies. Even though competent commanders are appointed to high positions in the Russian General Staff, repeated failures of the military now reflected directly on the Russian Tsar. When Nicholas II assumed command of the armed forces, he left Petersburg under the control of his wife, Alexandra, who was in turn dominated by Rasputin. In December of 1916, members of the court nobility and relatives of Nicholas II took part in the assassination of Rasputin and tried to convince Nicholas of the need for further reforms. By January of 1917, army officers, members of the Duma, high government officials, all have begun to come to agreement on the need for some form of drastic reform if Russia was to survive. This opens Act II, the months of January, February, and the fall of the Romanov dynasty. There's another problem in the study of the Russian revolutions that I haven't mentioned. This is the 13-day lag in the dates. The Russians did not adopt the Gregorian calendar until after the Bolsheviks came to power, so they retained the Julian calendar, which each 100 years lost a day, so that by the 20th century they're 13 days behind us, which is typical of the Russians, actually. That's pre-Bolshevik Russians. So that occasionally we'll have to mention the February-March Revolution or the October-November Revolution, because they're referred to many times by historians in that manner. Like many things in this world, there is no agreement as to call any particular event by any particular date. Some use the modern dating system and some use the old dating system, which makes for chaos in general. Under the strain of the war, the Russian distribution system, never efficient, had broken down. Food distribution reached the low point in February-March 1917 in the capital city, Petersburg. Once again, as in the French Revolution, bread was to play an important role. On February 23rd, 1917, old-style calendar, March 7th, new-style calendar, food riots and demonstrations, inflamed by revolutionaries, developed. The Ministry of the Interior had actually expected some type of reaction among the people and had worked out plans for the control of such reactions that depended upon the use of government troops stationed in Petersburg and, of course, Cossacks. The Tsarina Alexandra wired the Tsar that the movement was only a hooligan group and that reaction among the people would pass if only the Duma will behave itself. Few officials of the imperial government realized the significance of the February riots in Petersburg. On the 25th of February, the Tsar ordered the commander of the district to suppress all disorders on the streets of the capital. The most significant of all actions was the fraternization of the Petersburg troops with the street mob. On the morning of the 27th of February, the 12th of March, new style, the regiments began to kill their commanding officers and join the people in the streets. Forces loyal to the imperial government shrank from 100,000 troops in Petersburg to 2,000, which were besieged in the Admiralty buildings. The revolution had taken place. Crane Brinton, in his Anatomy of a Revolution, stated that if only a few resolute forces had remained, or a few of the regiments had remained loyal to the Tsar, the revolution could have been put down. This is not quite correct. Many of the troops did remain loyal. Many of the officers remained loyal. They were executed. The troops had interesting ways of getting rid of their officers. And once again, the gore of revolutions isn't necessarily a part of the study of revolutions. The amazing character of the rapid collapse of the Tsarist government was so complete that most of the Russian political groups and government officials had not realized what had taken place. No one, despite Bolshevik claims, had planned the revolution. It simply happened. Before we can go any further into the phases of the revolution, it becomes necessary to establish a new set of principal characters. Actually, not one, but two revolutionary governments came into being almost simultaneously. On March 12th, new style now, February 27th, old style, two distinct groups were to meet in the ancient Tsarida Palace in the city of Petersburg. One was called the Soviet of Workers' Deputies, similar in organization to the Workers' Councils, or Soviets, which had played the leading role in the Revolution of 1905. The second was the Provisional Committee of the Duma. It had met to discuss the ukaz of the Tsar proroguing the Duma. The Duma Committee refused to end its sessions and called upon the Tsar to change his attitude. The President of the Duma, M.V. Rodzianko, appealed personally to the Grand Duke Michael to convince the Tsar of the seriousness of the situation in Petersburg, for by now imperial police had disappeared from the streets. In fact, all imperial officials had disappeared. The attitude of the Tsar is reflected in the fatuous statement that fat Rodzianko has again written me some nonsense to which I will not even reply. On the 12th of March, the Tsar wrote in his diary, "Went for a walk, shot 2 ducks, had tea." Nothing happened. The Tsar was not the only one in Russia who did not understand what was happening. By popular consent, as of February 27th or March 12th, 1917, the Tsarist government ceased to function in its own capital. The revolution which had long been awaited had come so unexpectedly that the various political factions in Russia were caught off balance. It would be wise at this point to digress from the main story of the revolution to an analysis of some of the central tendencies in the political factions existent at the time of the revolution. The word central tendencies is used because no true political parties, as we know them in the West, actually existed in Tsarist Russia. There were factions of the left and center, since almost immediately with the overthrow of the Tsarist power, the right disappeared. These factions in Russian history are given names to distinguish them from other groups, but it would be foolish to assume that party loyalty, with a few exceptions, and a definite party philosophy covered the groups who made up the various factions. One group operating within the Duma is the Constitutional Democrats, or Cadets. This group was generally in favor of bourgeois constitutional government, with moderate reforms in the economic system. Its main spokesmen in the Duma, and later in the provisional government, were Prince Lvov and Paul N. Milyukov. It should be pointed out that the Cadets were also Russian nationalists and opposed any dissolution of the Tsarist Empire. Another group, similar to the cadets in political and economic thought, were the Octobrists, whose major spokesmen were Alexander Guchkov and the Ukrainian leader M.I. Tereshchenko. Probably the main faction which could have claimed, if elections were held, the major support of the Russian peasantry, and thus the majority of the Russian people, were the Social Revolutionaries, or SRs. This group was split into many factions, however, and ranged from constitutional reformers on the right to out-and-out political and economic revolutionaries on the left. The most outstanding social revolutionary in the provisional government was to be Alexander Kerensky, who also is a classic example of the lack of political cohesion among the factions, because for the most part, Kerensky did not follow the dictate of the Social Revolutionary Party. A group that played a very small role in the provisional government, but who actually dominated in league with the Social Revolutionaries, the Soviets, were the Social Democrats. The Social Democrats, or SDs, were divided into two major groups. They are the Mensheviks under the leadership of Chekhovsky, who was chairman of the Petrograd Soviet, and the Bolsheviks under the leadership of the Lenin. The Social Democrats favored a Marxist revolution, but in keeping with the Marxist philosophy, most of the Social Democrats believed that a bourgeois society would have to exist before a communist society could be formed by revolution. It should be pointed out that the Mensheviks, who were more popular than the Bolsheviks, were similar to the Social Revolutionaries in their lack of party discipline. In fact, the most disciplined political faction in Russia in the troubled months of February to October were the Bolsheviks. Further complicating the political situation during the revolution were demands of various nationalistic groups, such as the Ukrainians, the Baltic peoples, the Caucasians, the Central Asiatic peoples, for some form of national autonomy. The great mass of the Russian peoples were not used to political democracy and did not understand the constitutional political process. Millions of people had been cut adrift during the war. Tens of thousands of army deserters were scattered about the land, most of them with weapons from the army. The war had inured the people to brutality and callousness toward life and property. Ancient antagonisms were unleashed in the countryside: peasant against landowner, Cossack against peasant, Ukrainian against Russian, Orthodox Christian against Jew. A million incidents of anarchy and chaos, resulting in violence and death, covered the coming months with a stream of horror. This, then, was the confused political situation in Russia. On March 15th, one private tragedy was acted out at Pskov at 2 o'clock in the morning, when Nicholas II realized that the Romanov autocracy in Russia was finished. He signed the manifesto granting responsible constitutional government. But like most reactionaries, Nicholas's understanding came too late. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, various members of the Duma and his own chiefs of staff convinced him that he must abdicate. He did so in favor of his son. At 10 o'clock in the evening, even this step was not acceptable, and so he abdicated in favor of his brother, the Grand Duke Michael Alexandrovich. Even this was not to be accepted either to the Russian people or to his brother, who, swayed by a delegation from the provisional government the following day, refused to accept the crown. Thus, on March 15th, the Romanov dynasty came to an end. The personal tragedy of Nicholas and his family did not end, however, until the night of July 16, 1918, when the Tsar, all the members of his family, his doctors, servants, and even his pet spaniel, Jimmy, were wiped out in the Ural mountain city of Ekaterinburg, now Sverdlovsk. The Romanov personal tragedy should not occupy too much the attention of the observer of the Russian Revolution. Their significance ended when the troops in Petersburg joined with the mobs on March 12, 1917. Russia's history passed into the hands of other people, and it is with them that we must concern ourselves. Let us return to the Taurida Palace, which for several days was to be the scene of a vast throng of Duma representatives, workers and soldiers delegates to the Soviet, government officials, red sailors from Kronstadt, and the scrappings of humanity, who can always be found gathered about a fire or some disaster. In the rooms of the Taurida Palace, two groups began to rule Russia: the Provisional Government, which received recognition of the Western Allies as the official government of Russia, and attempted to exercise legal authority over the course of the revolution, and the Soviet of Workers' Deputies, which did not claim to be the government of Russia, but without whose cooperation the Provisional Government could not function. On March 15th, Nicholas II had recognized Prince Lvov as head of the Provisional Government. Lvov was assisted in the operation of the Russian government by various members of the Constitutional Democratic Party, such as Milyukov, who was head of the Foreign Office, and also by members of the Octoberist parties, such as Alexander Guchkov, who was in charge of the Navy Department, and M.I. Tereshchenko, who was head of the Ministry of Finances. Lvov had also accepted two members of the Social Revolutionary Party, who were influential in the Soviet, to share power in the government. Only one of the Social Revolutionaries accepted a government position. This was Alexander Kerensky, a former Duma member and a man who had shown great energy amidst the general chaos in organizing some form of government activity in the early days of the revolution. Kerensky was the link with the Soviet, but it should be pointed out that he broke with the executive committee of his own group, the Social Revolutionaries, to take a position in the Provisional Government. One may well ask, when considering the position of the Provisional Government vis-a-vis the Soviet, why didn't the Soviet of Workers and eventually Soldiers, Deputies, seize power and rule as the government of Russia? To understand the reluctance on the part of the Soviets to seize power, one must examine these curious organizations, typical only to Russia and the Russian Revolution. The Soviets were controlled in the early days of the revolution by social revolutionaries and Mensheviks. In fact, control in the Soviets passed from week to week from one group to another. They were extremely democratic. The executive committee of the Soviet issued what was to be the most portentous of resolutions. Early in March, under Order Number 1, it called for the organization of soldiers' councils, and then requested all other Soviets, including the soldiers' councils, only to obey the orders of the Provisional Government if they did not conflict with the orders of the Soviets. This is an interesting aspect. When soldiers were ordered into battle, they would say, no, we have to consider this to decide whether it conflicts with the orders from the Soviet. And if the battle was a dangerous one in which they could possibly be injured, then almost all of them would agree that this must conflict with the orders of the Soviets. On the other hand, the Soviets refused to actually take power or to take responsibility for the actions of the Provisional Government. The reason for this lies within the Menshevik doctrine of revolution. The chairman of the Soviet, Chekhyevtya, was a Menshevik, and he, like other Mensheviks, believed that the February-March revolution was a bourgeois revolution, and that the Mensheviks should refrain from taking part in the Provisional Government lest they be discredited in the eyes of the proletariat. In this view, the Mensheviks were supported by most of the social revolutionaries. The Mensheviks further believed that the workers, or the Marxist revolutionaries, could only succeed when the bourgeois created the next stage in the Marxist order of things, that is, a capitalist society and a bourgeois government. In reality, no bourgeois government existed in Russia. What existed was a dual power situation in which one agency did not and one could not rule. Between March and June 1917, the situation was to become increasingly evident. The Provisional Government had decreed that a constituent assembly was to be chosen to create a new form of government for the Russian people. Between the time of the announcement of a calling for a constituent assembly and its election, the provisional government decided to act as a caretaker of Russian interests. Overnight forms of oppression and control over the people disappeared. Political prisoners were freed. Civil liberties granted. One by one in the major cities, the local governments developed, dominated almost always by Soviets. And the people of Russia began to rule themselves in a confused and disorganized manner. The provisional government, dominated as it was by cadets and Octobrists, attempted to continue Russia's participation in World War I, partly due to the enormous pressure placed upon the provisional government by the Allied representatives in Petersburg. The continuation of the war and the election of a constituent assembly were the only two measures on which all members of the provisional government were agreed. But to the mass of the Russian people, the important issues were not a constituent assembly, or even the continuation of the war, which many were coming to look upon as the Tsar's war. The important issue to the mass of the Russian peoples was the land question. The peasants and the deserting soldiers from the armies were beginning to seize the lands, drive off the landowners or kill them, and divide the land among themselves. Once the peasants took the land, they would accept no government except one which would guarantee their possession of their new lands. The provisional government was divided on the question of the recognition of the land distribution, and therefore put off deciding this most important question until the election of a constituent assembly. In the meantime, the weary war went on. Two members of the provisional government, Paulin Milyukov and Alexander Guchkov, Foreign Secretary and Secretary of War, announced that in pursuing the war Russian objectives were the annexation of the Straits, and further announced that Russia would not give up the war until a decisive victory over Germany had been obtained. These announcements flew in the face of popular discontent to a continuation of the war and made possible an increased strength on the part of the Mensheviks and Bolsheviks, who were now advocating the end of the imperialist nature of the war. Milyukov and Guchkov were forced to resign by May 15th, and on May 18th, Act 3 of our tragedy concludes with the creation of the first coalition government, in which Alexander Kerensky, as war minister, actually becomes the power, even though Lvov remains as president. In this first coalition government, the Mensheviks and social revolutionaries give up their consistent opposition to participating in the provisional government, and 6 of them become cabinet ministers. The only party to consistently oppose the provisional government and the war was now the Bolsheviks. By associating themselves with the provisional government, the Mensheviks and the social revolutionaries did discredit themselves in the eyes of a populace becoming more and more revolutionary. Alexander Kerensky, with little patience, had been waiting his chance to lead Russia. Between May and October 1917, he was to lose his leadership while making dramatic and grandiose speeches about Russia's destiny, the war, and so forth. Speeches that impressed very few peasants or workers, and even fewer soldiers, who were to do the dying for Russia's glory. Whether any other man could have continued the war and at the same time maintain revolutionary democracy is doubtful, but that the continuation of the war was the major force behind Kerensky's downfall is quite evident. Kerensky planned a great offensive similar to that of 1916. This offensive, called in history the Second Brusilov Offensive, was launched July 1st. On July 14th, it had collapsed, and with it, almost all order in the Russian armies on the front. On July 16th and 17th, there were riots in Petersburg. The government was able to suppress the rioters, and the Bolsheviks, who had been agitating for the overthrow of Kerensky, were attacked by the provisional government. Kerensky now assumed the prime ministership, but the cabinet, despite the inclusion of 11 socialists, was actually less radical than before. To suppress the left, Kerensky had opened the door to the right. Two flags in Europe have special significance: the red, which is the symbol of a radical revolution, and the white, the ancient symbol of counter-revolution. The white flag was soon to be raised by Tsarist officers and reactionary members of the Russian upper classes and their followers, while the red soon became the preserve of the Bolshevik Party. The role of the Bolshevik Party in the Russian Revolution is similar to that of the Jacobins in the French. The Bolsheviks started from a minority position. Their major leaders were not even in Russia at the time of the February-March Revolution. They never participated in the provisional government, but they were members of the Soviets, though a minority force until after July. Their advantage seemed to be in the quality of their leadership and in their demonstrated obedience to central command, although there are many examples of desertion even among Bolshevik Party members. On April 16, 1917, at the Finland station of Petersburg, an important arrival was greeted in the imperial waiting room by the President of the Soviets and a large number of workers, Mensheviks, social revolutionaries, and Bolsheviks. This man was V.I. Lenin, an exile from Russia since 1905, the acknowledged leader of the Bolshevik Party and one of the most analytical leaders of all time. In a speech before the waiting group and in a later conference, Lenin outlined the future course of the revolution. This has become known as the April Thesis. The following is a brief summary of Lenin's position. The war effort was attacked as imperialist. The dictatorship of the proletariat was to begin without an intervening bourgeois government. This dictatorship was to include the peasants, whom Marxists had looked upon as a petty capitalist. The provisional government was to be disapproved, and power transferred to the Soviets. A third international should be founded to support the world revolution. Lenin was now joined by a previous Menshevik opponent, Leon Trotsky, who then became instrumental in leading the Bolsheviks to power in Petersburg. When Trotsky returned to Petersburg from America, where he had been living, he was made chairman of the Petersburg Soviet. Even though the Kerensky government had survived the July demonstrations and the failure of the Brusilov Offensive, the Bolshevik power continued to develop. In order to oppose the Bolsheviks, the provisional government began to restrict revolutionary activities. Lenin was forced to flee to Finland, Trotsky imprisoned, and a new chief of staff for the army was chosen, Larv Kornilov, a reactionary general who had been able to maintain discipline of some degree among his troops. The stage was now prepared for the white flag of counter-revolution. The fourth act of the Russian tragedy merges into the fifth and final act, with Alexander Kerensky talking less and less about democratic revolutions and more about iron rule. Dictatorship of some form now became the question: Kerensky, Kornilov, or Lenin? Kornilov became the first to move. Believing that he had the approval of Kerensky, Kornilov had to move troops, or tried to move troops, towards the capital, and announced that now was the time to restore the death penalty in the rear. In a comedy of tragic significance, the contact man between Kornilov and Kerensky misled both men. Kerensky interpreted Kornilov's actions as against him and ordered Kornilov dismissed and arrested. The danger to the provisional government from the right opened the way to the extreme left. The Petrograd Soviet voted the Bolsheviks in power on September 13th, and September 18th the Moscow Soviet became Bolshevik. To counter the Kornilov troops, the Petrograd Soviet created its own armed guards. The Red Guards were to be the nucleus of the future Red Army and the force which enabled the Bolsheviks to seize power. Kornilov's troops never arrived. The railway workers refused to transport them, and the soldiers refused to act. Bolshevik popularity was now increasing at the cost of the revolutionary parties. The Mensheviks and social revolutionaries declined in strength, as the provisional government failed to solve the problems of war and refused to recognize the land seizure of the peasants. Bolshevik popularity increased also among the people not politically organized. By autumn, once again, food distribution had broken down, and the workers were in increasingly more desperate straits. Bolshevik leadership was finally dominant in most of the workers' Soviets and among the soldiers' Soviets. On October 23, 1917, at a secret conference in the home of the Menshevik N.N. Sukhanov, whose wife was a leading Bolshevik — what an interesting family arguments they must have had — Lenin called for the seizure of power. Not all Bolshevik leaders agreed that the time had come. Zinoviev and Kamenev refused to accept Lenin's demand and carried their argument to the party paper Pravda. The provisional government seemed powerless to act. On November 5th, Kerensky at last ordered the arrest of the Bolsheviks. Once again, loyal troops were ordered to the capital. The cadets, not to be confused with the constitutional Democrats, of the military school patrolled the streets. So contemptuous were the Bolsheviks of Kerensky's power that Lenin and the leading Bolsheviks who now occupied the Smolny Institute did not even maintain a guard. A small force of resolute men could have seized most of the Bolshevik leaders and perhaps have stopped their drive to power. On November 6th, Red Guards seized key public buildings practically without opposition. On November 7th, the cruiser Aurora shelled the Winter Palace. On November 8th, the Winter Palace was taken, and Kerensky and the provisional government ceased to exist. Kerensky commandeered a British staff car and fled with the British embassy flag on it. The Russian Revolution did not end on November 8th. The struggle between red and white was to continue. Foreign intervention was to prolong the tragic sufferings of the Russian people, and the Civil War was to make more ruthless the men who controlled the Russian government. Since the Bolshevik seizure of power, men have wondered what the future course of the revolution would be. There has been a constant attempt to interpret the events of the 20s and 30s in Russia in terms of classic theories of revolution. Were the Bolsheviks in the Thermidorian period? Did the revolution destroy itself with the victory of Lenin? Was the NEP a turn to the right, and Stalin a new czar, as Napoleon was a new Louis XIV? The Russian Revolution did seem to follow the pattern of right to center to extreme left and dictatorship, but there the pattern failed. The nature of the revolution begins to change under Stalin. Political centralism is maintained, and what Crane Brinton calls the rule of terror and virtue did not seem to die out. Yet social and economic revolution, directed by the central dictatorship, did create a revolution in education and economic activity. The new Soviet man emerges far more efficient, better educated, and for the most part enjoys far better material wealth than his Russian ancestors. After Stalin, even the dictatorship changed. Less brutality, more levity. Under Khrushchev, perhaps too much. More emphasis on enjoyment of consumer goods, and less on the waging of implacable revolutionary war against reaction and imperialism. Even a social and economic pyramid appears in which the material rewards obtained on a basis of skill and energy and not on need alone. For Russia, the revolution has been decisive. The political autocracy does not resemble the Tsarist predecessor. And who would challenge the statement that Lenin, Stalin, Malenkov, Khrushchev, Brezhnev, and Kosygin are not superior to Alexander I, Nicholas I, Alexander II, Alexander III, and Nicholas II? The revolution and the success of the Marxists has also made possible a dynamic experimentation with economic and social planning that has made the Soviet Union a great world power and a powerful antagonist in its bid to save the world from bourgeois imperialism by creating copies of its own reign of terror and virtue in every area of the world. Yet what must seem puzzling for the scientific Marxist member of the Soviet state is the fact that as the Marxists come to power in Eastern Europe and Asia, they do not always interpret the Russian Revolution correctly. China, Albania, Romania, Poland, and Yugoslavia have all begun to go their own way and in some cases to become the bitter enemy of the revolution as the Soviets view it. Even Moscow itself is becoming foreign to the old revolutionists of the October days, and how few are now left. Jazz, that decadent music of the West, can be heard in the hotels at night. Young people are more concerned with dress, automobiles, and a good career than with revolution. The government seems dominated by efficient, engineer-type bureaucrats who replaced the old revolutionary Khrushchev with attacks on his crudeness and vulgarity. The army is as large as ever, but has not seen revolutionary action since the Hungarian Revolution almost a decade ago. In fact, the army may more likely be involved in conflict with the revolutionary Chinese Marxists than with the Western world. Thus it appears that at last the Russian Revolution is reaching the final stage of revolution in history, that of a swing back to a more normal center of concern for human freedom and material needs. Yet a serious warning should be injected at this moment. When in 1922, and again after the first 5-year plan in 1933, such moves were discernible, the interpretations did not prove correct. The revolution and the reign of terror and virtue returned. The same could happen again. Under foreign pressure or due to domestic crisis, the Soviet government could revert to a more violent and revolutionary atmosphere. When we consider the type of power which the Soviets now possess and the demonic nature of a revolutionary fanatic, let us hope that the Russian Revolution, like those before and after it, has finally reached the point where its fires are banked and its significance is only in the social, economic, and cultural changes which attend every major revolution.